Thanks for staying with us. Now, ahead of the BRICS summit last year, you'd remember there was talk of possibly moving away from the dollar when it comes to trade for some countries. In a virtual address, you'd remember Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that the process of de-dollarization is irreversible and fast gaining pace. So, what became of that conversation? Let's speak now to Tshepo Mongoai, SABC News Economics Editor, who's joining us live now for this discussion. Tshepo, of course, it was one of the big talking points ahead of the BRICS summit last year. Was it just talk, or are we seeing some movement towards that particular move?
Well, we know that with China, they're quite gradual and directive in terms of their planning. And they usually are very strategic in terms of how they do things. But in reality, the US dollar is still the dominant trading currency the world over. And it's going to take a while. In South Africa, of course, we know that major companies, for example, Chinese companies, they buy most of our commodities, minerals. And we know these mining companies, they may argue that most of or some of their costs are in US dollars. They import a lot of heavy machineries from the US and Europe. So it's only fair that they would want to sell their commodities in US dollars simply because of that reason. But what we are seeing is that, of course, you see fast consumer goods that South Africans really buy from China. It could be online, mostly online, where you don't have any dollar that is featuring there. You have your prices in rand and they're converted into yuan. Simply because those goods are quite affordable. Their margins are very, very thin. And that's where you're starting to get a sense that China, of course, it favors them because trade between South Africa is in their favor. We are importing a whole lot of things. And you could see the plan is that get more South Africans buying Chinese goods and buying this clothes and so forth at very low margins. And exchanging them into yuan and increase the numbers and build a real strong momentum from that, because when it comes to big business, it's unlikely that you will make a significant impact. But of course, also in instances where the US dollar is actually very strong, it makes it difficult for South African companies also to buy in US dollar. So that's also another opportunities. But you also get a sense that some Chinese companies, they also still prefer to price some of their goods in US dollar because it's still appealing. But we know with China, once they put in a directive that this is what needs to be done, it happens. And so far, there is no sense that China has directed their companies to say, this is what you need to do. You need to avoid the dollars and make sure you move to other currencies. I don't get that sense, but it will happen very soon.
And it's quite interesting because you speak about these low products that people talk about, and I wonder what the impact of that is, because you see on social media a proliferation of these goods, and people talk about how, for them, they get these things for next to nothing, and they are ordering. I mean, there's even now some threads where you see people teaching people on how to order and all of that. So what becomes the impact of those kinds of conversations on the bigger discussions that would then be taking place on summits like BRICS, for example?
Well, we all know China's position as the largest exporter has been questioned, and they are really trying to cement that position. They realize that it cannot just be the internal within China consumption that drives the economy. They're thinking globally. And they realize there's some concerns that have been raised. They've got huge manufacturing capacity. They cannot just leave it. And they are able to produce for the world over. And that's the position that they're taking. And of course, another thing is the Chinese yuan. It's stable. you know exactly what you're expecting when you exchange. So that would also make it appealing for many businesses who wants to do business, and of course many of them, they are already seeing those benefits. And China wants to position the yuan as one of the global trading currencies, and I think they are gradually and slowly trying to find ways and means to do that. And of course, selling, tons and tons of their small items at next to nothing. They will probably reach that position, not totally unseat the US dollar, but it will be a competition.
And when one looks at, for example, trade between China and South Africa, you think about 2022, where we're seeing, numbers growing around to $57 billion US. But I wonder then, when it comes to the next summit, can we still see this conversation continue, or is it the end of this talk of possibly de-dollarizing, looking at the fact that, as you say, some businesses still prefer the dollar to some of the other currencies?
Well, it's a multipolar world. It's much likely that you are going to see, many divided, and it really depends on what you want to do, and what trade. Whether you're a consumer, you will find the consumers split. Businesses also, you'll find them split, depending on where they get value. But the reality is, a large share of manufactured goods the world over are manufactured in China, and we have to deal with China, and probably they have a strategy in terms of how they want to supply the world. And currency, it's what you need to trade and to buy those products. And if you can find those products much more affordable and value for money if you use a specific currency, then we know that that currency would probably be used for by many businesses. And the reality is, if you look at on our balance of trade, we are importing much more from China than we are exporting commodities. And commodities, of course, they have their cyclical challenges with their production and all that. But look at the consumer side. That's where the value is.
Tshepo, quite an interesting one. And let's see then, what becomes of this conversation, because when you speak to the finance minister, he has very interesting, insights to share on this particular subject. But thank you so much for your time. That is my colleague there, Tshepo Mongoai.